The man known to history as Sir Francis Drake was born at Crowndale Farm near Tavistock in the county of Devon in England. The year and date of his birth are unknown, with estimates ranging from anywhere between 1538 and 1544, with around 1540 being the most likely date. His father was Edmund Drake, who was a yeoman farmer, the second son of John and Marjorie Drake, who farmed over 180 acres of land leased from the abbot of Tavistock Abbey. Francis's mother was Mary Milway, who Edmund married in the late 1530s. Together, they would have 12 children, of whom Francis was the eldest. He was most likely named after his godfather, Francis Russell, later the second Earl of Bedford, whose father John, Lord Russell, was granted Tavistock Abbey and its surrounding lands following the dissolution of the monasteries in the mid to late 1530s. Francis Drake grew up during a period of religious instability brought about by the English Reformation, launched in 1534 when King Henry VIII of England took the Church of England under state control and broke away from the authority of the Pope in Rome, who refused him permission to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The Protestant Reformation was driven by the king's religious advisors who believed that the Roman Catholic Church was corrupt and decadent. Nevertheless, in these early years, the bulk of the English population remained Roman Catholics, and Protestantism only slowly found purchase, first amongst elites in the towns, and then spreading throughout southern England to places like Drake's native Devon. In 1549, Edmund Drake moved his family to Kent. Francis later claimed that his devout Protestant family was escaping from religious persecution following the Prayer Book Rebellion, which erupted in southwest England in 1549 when Catholics took up arms in response to the introduction of the Protestant Book of Common Prayer, although legal documents from 1548 suggest that Edmund Drake had been indicted for 2 robbery offences and had already left Tavistock, even though he was later pardoned. After moving to Kent, Edmund Drake served as a Protestant minister for the sailors of the King's Navy in Gillingham on the estuary of the River Medway. The young Francis would have seen military and commercial ships sailing up and down the river. Although the English Navy would eventually become the most powerful in the world, it was only in 1520 that Henry VIII established a permanent navy to protect the English Channel. While Henry spent much of his reign fighting wars against France, his divorce from Catherine of Aragon led to increased tensions with Spain, ruled by Catherine's nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The Spanish were devout Catholics and sought to bring the Church of England back under the Pope's authority. Their cause was boosted in 1553 when Henry's son and heir, King Edward VI, a devout Protestant, died at the age of 16. His Catholic half-sister Mary succeeded him. She immediately restored papal authority before marrying Charles V's eldest son, the future King Philip II of Spain, in 1554. The marriage negotiations provoked a Protestant insurrection in Kent, led by Thomas Wyatt in January 1554, aiming to overthrow Mary and place her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth on the throne. Francis Drake would have heard of the rebellion and its suppression, as well as the campaign of anti-Protestant persecution which followed in the mid-1550s. While some Protestants fled to the European continent, Edmund Drake remained in Kent. Young Francis's early years were thus ones of considerable political and religious instability across England. The fortunes of the Drakes improved in 1558 following the untimely death of Queen Mary from uterine cancer and the accession of her half-sister as Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth immediately split from Rome again and restored the independence of the Church of England as a Protestant church. In January 1561, Edmund was ordained a deacon and became vicar of the Church of St. Mary in nearby Upchurch. While Edmund taught his son the basics of reading and writing, in the 1550s Francis was apprenticed to the master of a bark, or small sailing ship, that was engaged in trade with France and the Netherlands, the latter of which were then under Spanish rule. This was the period of his apprenticeship at sea, as he learned the skills which would make him one of the first seamen of the 16th century. By his late teens or early 20s, he was already in command of a ship, and with his small crew, he headed for his native Devon, the home of some of England's finest mariners in the early modern era. There, he established contact with his distant relatives, the sea captains William and John Hawkins. The Hawkins brothers were determined to break the Portuguese monopoly on the slave trade in West Africa that had been given papal sanction via the Treaty of Tordesillas all the way back in 1494, an agreement which divided any newly discovered lands beyond Europe between Spain and Portugal along a meridian line. The Portuguese had sovereignty over the eastern portion, while the western part was given to Spain. While the Spanish initially used the Native American population to exploit the mineral wealth of the New World, much of the existing population had been wiped out by disease. With a labor shortage in the Americas, Portuguese slave traders soon began purchasing captured slaves from local rulers along the West African coast and transporting them across the Atlantic to sell them to the Spanish in the Americas. John Hawkins, in particular, was determined to muscle into this trade and capture some of it for England. In 1562 and 1564, he led 2 slaving expeditions to West Africa. It is possible that Drake accompanied Hawkins' first 2 voyages as a common seaman. Though his personal views on the morality of this human traffic are unknown, he was inspired by the profit-making potential and hoped to share in it. While Hawkins was preparing for a 3rd expedition in 1566, Queen Elizabeth forbade him from leaving in order to avoid potential hostilities. Nevertheless, on the 9th of November 1566, Hawkins allowed 3 ships to set sail commanded by a relative, Captain John Lovell. Drake was a member of this expedition. Over the next few months, Lovell attacked and looted 5 Portuguese ships carrying slaves and commodities before sailing towards the Spanish West Indies. By May 1567, he arrived at Rio de la Hacha on the American mainland, now known as Rio Hacha in Colombia, where he was refused a license to trade by the Spanish colonial authorities by the port's treasurer, Miguel de Castellanos. After recognizing his weak bargaining position, Lovell set ashore more than 90 Africans and was back in Plymouth in early September. Hawkins was determined to exact vengeance on the Spanish following Lovell's failed mission, and in 1567 he was preparing 6 ships for a 4th voyage. The Queen supplied 2 ships from her navy, including the flagship Jesus of Lubeck, on which Drake served as an officer. Among the financial backers of the expedition was William Cecil, the Queen's Secretary of State at that time, and the lead figure in her government over a period of 4 decades. After leaving Plymouth on the 2nd of October 1567, the fleet raided the islands off the coast of West Africa before seizing several Portuguese vessels one of which Drake was appointed as captain of. Upon his arrival at Sierra Leone, Hawkins made a deal with some local native chiefs to support them in battle against their local enemies, leading to the capture of 250 African slaves in January 1568. After crossing the Atlantic, Hawkins returned to Rio de la Hacha to settle scores, dispatching 2 ships ahead of him as a vanguard. It is understood that by now Drake had been transferred to the command of the larger ship, the Judith. A skirmish broke out after the 2 English ships arrived at Rio de la Hacha, with the English retaliating by bombarding the house of the treasurer, Miguel de Castellanos. Eventually, after a tense standoff, the Spanish were effectively coerced into buying some of the slaves Hawkins and Drake had brought with them from Africa. A hurricane in mid-August forced Hawkins and Drake to take refuge at San Juan de Ulua, near Veracruz in Mexico, where they arrived in mid-September 1568. 2 days later, a formidable Spanish fleet, carrying the new Viceroy of Mexico, Don Martín Enríquez, appeared at the port. A fierce battle ensued on the 23rd of September, during which several English ships were crippled. Hawkins decided to abandon his flagship in favour of the Minion, the second of the Queen's ships, and arranged for some of the treasure from the Jesus to be transferred to Drake's Judith. As the Spanish sent a fire ship into the midst of the English squadron, the Minion and the Judith made their escape from the harbour. The following morning, while the Minion remained at the mouth of the harbour, the Judith was nowhere to be seen. Hawkins later accused Drake of abandoning him and sailing off with his treasure, but the latter claimed that he believed Hawkins was lost. Sailing alone for the first time, Drake nursed the Judith back to Plymouth, arriving back to England in January 1569. Hawkins guided the Minion to Cornwall a few days later with most of the treasure, but only 15 survivors. Drake hurried to London to report on the expedition and to request an official indemnity for their actions in the Americas. Owing to the deteriorating relations between England and Spain at the time, with the Spanish accusing the English of encouraging the Dutch Protestants, who had revolted against Spanish rule in the Netherlands in 1568, Elizabeth's government did not censure Drake or Hawkins. After a short stay in London, Drake appears to have returned to Plymouth, where, on the 4th of July 1569, he married Mary Newman, who may have been the sister of a shipmate. In 1570, Drake took 2 small ships crewed by around 50 men in total and sailed to the Caribbean. Unlike other English seamen who obtained commissions to attack Spanish shipping in the English Channel from Prince William of Orange, leader of the Dutch revolt, Drake did so without authority from any government. He appears to have used the 1570 trip as a reconnaissance mission to identify weaknesses in Spanish defences. During this expedition, Drake visited Panama and identified weaknesses in the supply route between Panama City and the port of Nombre de Dios, where ships from Spain loaded up with silver and gold once a year. Armed with the intelligence he gathered, Drake returned to the West Indies in February 1571 with a single ship, the Swan. Despite meeting resistance at Nombre de Dios, Drake's men were better armed and sailed towards Panama City, capturing more than a dozen small barks before raiding along the coast. He returned to England a rich man, carrying plunder worth up to 160,000 pesos, twice as much as Hawkins' combined profits from 3 slaving voyages. Drake's success was celebrated in Plymouth and inspired several other English seamen to attack Spanish colonial possessions in the Americas during what was now an unofficial Cold War between Spain and England, since Queen Elizabeth had been excommunicated by Pope Pius V in 1570. In this environment, figures like Drake and Hawkins were ideal tools of the English government, allowing them to attack Spain's colonial empire in a way which Elizabeth and her ministers could later claim they were not responsible for when the Spanish government protested. In May 1572, Drake left Plymouth on a more ambitious venture, this time appointing his brother John to captain the Swan while he commanded the larger Pasco. Arriving to the Caribbean in July, they sailed towards Nombre de Dios, where Drake led a force of around 70 men to raid the town. A hastily assembled Spanish militia fired at the English and wounded Drake in the leg, but a timely intervention from a small band of Englishmen, led by John Drake, caused the Spanish to flee. Drake had hoped to discover a large store of silver here, but he had to make a swift retreat as he collapsed from his leg wound, withdrawing to the Bastimentos Islands in western Panama. The failed attempt prompted Drake and his crew to head for Cartagena in Colombia in the hopes of capturing some ships. In order to keep his fleet manned, Drake decided to scuttle the Swan at this time and ceded command of the Pasco to his brother John. Drake was also inspired to cultivate the support of escaped black slaves or cimarrones in the region, who had more information about the convoys of Spanish treasure being brought to Nombre de Dios through the jungle. By September, he met with a group of cimarrones who informed him that the treasure would not be brought up for another 5 months. After supervising the cimarrones as they built a base named Fort Diego near Cape Cativa, Drake sailed for Cartagena. 2 days later, as a Spanish ship sailed past Fort Diego, John Drake led an attempt to board the vessel but was shot in the stomach and fatally wounded. Thereafter, Francis harassed Spanish shipping around Cartagena during the autumn before being forced to return on the 3rd of November, with supplies running low. Upon returning to Fort Diego, Drake learned of John's death. Less than 2 months later, a yellow fever epidemic killed 40% of the men, including another of his brothers, Joseph Drake. At the end of January, Drake received intelligence from his cimarrones allies that the Spanish treasure fleet had arrived at Nombre de Dios. A combined force of 18 Englishmen and 30 cimarrones made their way through the jungle towards Panama City to intercept the treasure train, during which he caught sight of the Pacific Ocean for the first time. After learning of the approach of 3 mule trains laden with gold and silver, Drake set an ambush near the town of Venta Cruces on the 14th of February 1573. However, he only managed to capture a few of the treasure mules, as the Spanish were alerted to his presence in the region and split up. Thereafter, he continued plundering the region. His second-in-command, John Oxenham, managed to seize a Spanish ship full of provisions. In late March, Drake was cruising around searching for more prizes when he came across a ship commanded by the Frenchman Guillaume Le Testu with 70 men. The 2 men joined forces against the Spanish and continued their privateering for several further weeks, seizing a mule train carrying 200,000 pesos of treasure, which the English took half of. Thereafter, though, the Spanish managed to coordinate a response to these joint English-French depredations, and Le Testu was killed in an attack in late April. Not long afterwards, Drake collected together as much of the loot as could reasonably be carried, reassembled his small fleet, and sailed for home. He arrived back in England in August 1573, having left behind a trail of destruction in Spain's American colonies, which earned him the Spanish nickname El Draque, or the Dragon. Drake returned home at an inopportune moment, as England and Spain were engaged in diplomatic negotiations to try and defuse the tensions between the two nations and avoid an outright war. As part of this, Elizabeth agreed to rein in privateers like Drake from attacking Spain's colonies and shipping in the New World. Accordingly, Drake kept a low profile for the next 2 years. During this time, he played a role in the first Earl of Essex, Walter Devereux's, efforts to colonise parts of East Ulster in the north of Ireland. Although Henry VIII had declared himself King of Ireland in 1541, the Crown had struggled to impose its rule over the dozens of Irish lordships throughout the country. In an effort to conquer Ulster, permission had been granted to figures like Essex to colonise portions of the province in the early 1570s. However, Essex had failed dismally, squandering enormous amounts of money between 1573 and 1575 and achieving nothing. Facing imminent recall from Ireland in the summer of 1575, he set out to lay waste to the province with his army in an effort to save face. The final act of this campaign was a naval assault on Rathlin Island off the north coast of Ireland. Drake played a key role in this, piloting the Pelican, which took part in the raid. Over the space of a week in late July 1575, the expedition massacred hundreds of non-combatants across Rathlin Island, with as many as 600 Scots and Irish settlers there killed. It is one of the blacker marks on Drake's reputation. In the aftermath of the raid on Rathlin, with relations between England and Spain deteriorating once again over a wide range of issues, Drake began petitioning the government of Queen Elizabeth with a plan he had had in gestation for some time: an expedition to the Pacific Ocean and the South Seas to attack Spain's empire once again, this time in Chile and Peru, where its settlements were very thinly defended, as the Spanish did not expect any attacks here in the Pacific. Drake's enterprise received backing from a syndicate that included two of Elizabeth's most powerful courtiers, Sir Francis Walsingham and Robert Dudley, 1st Earl of Leicester. According to the initial proposals, Drake was to sail through the Straits of Magellan at the southern tip of the Americas, then up the Pacific coast of South America, attacking the thinly defended Spanish settlements there, before returning to England the same way. Against the background of deteriorating Anglo-Spanish relations, Queen Elizabeth provided 1,000 crowns on the understanding that Drake would also be raiding Spanish shipping. Nevertheless, the Queen retained plausible deniability by refraining from issuing written instructions and refusing Drake's request for one of her ships. In 1576, Drake built his flagship, the Pelican, a vessel 30 meters in length and 6 meters wide with 22 guns, better known by its later name, the Golden Hind. Drake's fleet sailed out of Plymouth on the 15th of November 1577, with many of the men under the mistaken impression that they were headed to the Mediterranean. Almost immediately the ships were damaged in a storm and took refuge in Falmouth, before returning to Plymouth to make the necessary repairs. On the 13th of December, the fleet set sail once again, arriving off the coast of northwest Africa 2 weeks later, where the crew realized that they were not going to Alexandria. Drake captured a Portuguese ship along with its pilot, Nuno da Silva. After keeping the ship, renamed the Mary, and its pilot, Drake sent the rest of the crew back in one of his pinnaces. Drake initially gave command of the Mary to Thomas Doughty, a nobleman with court connections who had been with Drake in Ireland, but soon the men switched commands. Doughty appears to have been accused of stealing some loot on the Mary, and after an investigation, Drake made the exchange as a sign of his continued trust in Doughty. However, over the course of the journey to South America, Doughty began to stir up trouble on the flagship, which led Drake to demote him to the command of the Swan, a small supply boat. The fleet reached the coast of Brazil on the 5th of April, and Drake sailed southwards, guided by Nuno's Portuguese maps. During the southward journey, a storm separated the fleet, and Drake stopped at the Deseado River to regroup. When the Swan returned to the fleet on the 17th of May, Drake learned that Doughty was continuing to exaggerate his connections to the court and his usefulness to the voyage. Drake responded to this challenge to his authority by tying Doughty against the mast of one of his ships. Having lost a number of men to disease, Drake decided to scuttle the Swan. By the 20th of June, Drake reached Fort St. Julian, a little north of the Strait of Magellan. 10 days later, matters came to a head with Doughty, and in order to avoid a mutiny developing, Drake placed him on trial and had him executed on the 2nd of July. On the 11th of August, as he prepared to tackle the Straits of Magellan, Drake assembled the company and informed them that while at sea, sailors and gentlemen were of equal rank. He acknowledged the dangers of the onward passage and offered one of his ships, the Marigold, to those who wanted to return home, but for the time being all stuck with him. On the 17th of August, after consolidating his fleet once more, Drake set forth with 3 ships, the Pelican, the Elizabeth, and the Marigold. As he was set to enter the Straits on the 20th of August, he renamed the Pelican the Golden Hind, in honour of his patron at court in England, Sir Christopher Hatton, the Lord Chancellor of England, whose family crest featured an image of a golden hind. Although nobody on the ship had ever crossed through these waters, Drake managed it within 16 days and was in the Pacific on the 6th of September. While contemporary maps showed that the Chilean coast extended northwest, Drake discovered that it extended almost directly north. In late September, the fleet was separated in a storm. The Marigold and its 29 men were lost, while the Elizabeth decided to turn round and returned to England in June 1579. Drake decided to take refuge from the weather in the Straits of Magellan, where he discovered that the land to the south, Tierra del Fuego, was an island and not a continental landmass, and it was possible to sail to the south of it. The passage around Cape Horn, on the tip of South America, was thus named Drake's Passage. After the storm cleared on the 28th of October, Drake headed north up the coast of Chile for Peru. On the 25th of November, he reached the island of Mocha off the Chilean coast, but after initially being welcomed by the native population, Drake's men were attacked. 2 Englishmen were mortally wounded, another 2 captured and killed, while the rest of the party, including Drake, suffered serious wounds. Drake led the survivors back to the Golden Hind, keen to do more damage to Spanish trade, and continued raiding Spanish ships and ports along the coast, taking prisoners along the way. While he generally treated his prisoners well, on occasion he would torture them if he suspected they were hiding treasure from him. Although some of these raids yielded little riches, Drake eventually struck gold when he captured a Spanish ship with 25,000 pesos of gold near Lima, before successfully netting a significantly larger prize, the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, on the 1st of March. At least 360,000 pesos worth of treasure was on board, including 36 kilograms of gold and 26 tons of silver. This was an absolute fortune in 16th century terms. After capturing a Spanish ship and taking on provisions at the port of Huaculco in Mexico in mid-April, Drake was ready to return to England. Although he had initially planned to return the way he came, he decided against it due to the perilous weather he experienced and the belief that the Spanish might be ready to intercept him. Instead, he decided to search for the fabled Northwest Passage, which was said to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific in North America. He sailed as far as 48 degrees north, near the present-day border between Canada and the United States, without finding any sign of the passage, and decided to turn back south. On the 17th of June, he stopped in what is now Northern California to repair the Golden Hind. Though Drake took the precaution of building a fort to protect his men from potential attack from the native Miwok people, it was their first encounter with Europeans, and they proved welcoming. On the 26th of June, they placed a crown on Drake's head in a ceremony which led Drake to believe that he was being crowned king and prompted him to claim the land for Queen Elizabeth, christening it Nova Albion. After leaving on the 23rd of July, Drake sailed westwards into the Pacific. He was now intent on circumnavigating the world, a feat which had only been accomplished on one other occasion, by the Spanish expedition initially led by Ferdinand Magellan over half a century earlier, between 1519 and 1522. By early November, Drake and his men had sailed across the Pacific Ocean and had reached the Moluccas, the fabled Spice Islands in the East Indies. Here, Drake made contact with local chiefs such as Sultan Babula of Ternate, and purchased several tons of spices like pepper and nutmeg, goods which were worth more by weight than gold itself back in Europe. Unfortunately, though, after the Golden Hind ran aground upon a reef near the Celebes Islands in January 1580, Drake had to take the decision to dump a large portion of the spice in order to reduce the weight of the ship. Thereafter, they resumed their homeward journey. After rounding the southern coast of Java in late March, Drake sailed around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa in June. 3 months later, on the 26th of September 1580, the Golden Hind arrived in Plymouth. Drake had now led only the second successful circumnavigation of the globe and had brought back an absolutely enormous bounty of gold, silver, and spices to England. Although concerned that her reception of him would exacerbate tensions with Spain, Queen Elizabeth could not resist claiming a portion of the plunder, and she soon invited Drake to court and promised that he would be well received. Bearing gold and silver gifts, over a 6-hour interview, Drake informed the Queen of his adventures and the newly discovered lands he claimed on her behalf. He was allowed to take his share of £10,000 and another £14,000 for his crew before the spoils were registered with the government. Elizabeth recognized that Drake was a popular hero for the Protestant cause and decided to keep the looted treasure and loaned part of the sum to the Dutch Protestants. During the New Year festivities in 1581, Drake was awarded sumptuous gifts from the Queen. At the beginning of April, He took the Golden Hind from Plymouth to Deptford in Kent, where he was knighted. Now in his early 40s, Sir Francis Drake had been honoured by his queen for over a decade of bold enterprises on the high seas, the expense of her Spanish rival. On account of his increased status and wealth, Drake bought the former monastery of Buckland Abbey near Plymouth for £3,400, taking possession in the summer of 1581. He also purchased numerous other properties in Devon, becoming a major landholder here in the process. As a man of considerable means, he began to involve himself in politics. After briefly becoming a Member of Parliament for Camelford in Cornwall in early 1581, he became Mayor of Plymouth in September, and during a short stint in the office installed a compass at Plymouth Hoe and attempted to regulate the pilchard trade. But Drake still had no heir for his extensive properties when his wife Mary died in January 1583. During the summer of 1581, Drake was also involved in a plan to raise an Anglo-French fleet to support the cause of the Portuguese pretender Dom Antonio, Prior of Crato, an illegitimate nephew of King Henry of Portugal, who wished to challenge King Philip II of Spain, who had become King of Portugal while Drake had been away from Europe on his circumnavigation. The enterprise collapsed in August when King Philip threatened to formally declare war on England. At the general election of 1584, Drake was elected for Bossiney in Cornwall. He was soon named to 4 committees involving maritime affairs, ranging from trade in fish to the condition of the navy and the colonization of America. Drake was therefore part of the parliamentary committee which authorized Sir Walter Raleigh to send an expedition to establish what became the Roanoke colony in North Carolina in 1585. In February 1585, Drake married Elizabeth Sydenham, a young woman in her early 20s whose father was the wealthy Sir George Sydenham, High Sheriff of Somerset. Though his second marriage was a further sign of his social advancement, this one also remained childless. Having been ashore for almost 5 years, Drake was eager to return to the seas, and opportunity beckoned in the early summer of 1585. Philip of Spain had improved his position in the ongoing war with the Netherlands after the rebel leader William of Orange was assassinated in 1584, and his talented commander, the Duke of Parma, was poised to capture Antwerp. Queen Elizabeth responded to Dutch pleas for help, and on the 1st of July authorized Drake to launch a raiding expedition against the Spanish colonies in the Americas. After the formal declaration of war between England and Spain, after more than 2 decades of an unofficial Cold War, on the 10th of August, Drake set sail commanding a fleet of over 30 vessels on the 14th of September. When the fleet appeared off the port of Vigo in northwestern Spain in early October, the local authorities saw resistance was futile and allowed Drake to resupply. Although Philip had improved his defences after Drake's circumnavigation, he and his admirals feared they would be overwhelmed by this large English fleet. After narrowly missing a treasure fleet from Peru, Drake attacked Santiago. After finding little plunder, he occupied the town with a force of 1,000 soldiers under their commander Christopher Carlisle and terrorized the local area in an effort to secure a healthy return for his financial backers back home. As Drake sailed into the Caribbean, a deadly disease swept through the fleet and claimed the lives of more than 200 men. In the early hours of New Year's Day, 1586, Drake prepared to attack Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola, the oldest Spanish city in the Americas. While the Spanish cannon fire fell short of the English ships, 2 columns of English soldiers quickly swept aside the hastily assembled Spanish militia. The Englishmen began to loot the cathedral and churches, but were disappointed to find that Santo Domingo was not as rich as they had expected. After seizing 16,000 ducats, Drake managed to extort another 25,000 from the city authorities, pocketing the equivalent of around £11,000. After sacking Santo Domingo, Drake headed for Cartagena and arrived there on the 9th of February 1586. The city was prepared for Drake's arrival and had some 2,000 men to man the defences. Carlisle led 1,000 men in a night attack, and many Spanish fled, and by the 11th of February Drake was in complete control of the city. The Englishman forced the Spanish authorities to hand over more than 100,000 ducats. After another disease killed around 100 of his men, Drake left Cartagena and decided to begin his return journey. On the way to the new English colony at Roanoke Island off modern-day North Carolina, he sacked the Spanish town and fort of St. Augustine in Florida. At Roanoke, after initially requesting additional provisions, on the 18th of June, the colony's governor, Ralph Lane, decided to abandon the colony and accompanied Drake back to England. Raleigh sent a second expedition in 1587 which re-established the settlement on Roanoke, but the entire colony later disappeared without trace. On the 22nd of July 1586, Drake arrived in Portsmouth. Although the expedition was a financial disaster and called into question the sponsorship of further expeditions, Drake once again caused the Spanish much embarrassment. After this latest embarrassment, King Philip resolved to defeat England once and for all. He was already preparing a great fleet to sail to the English Channel and carry an invasion force led by the Duke of Parma from the Spanish Netherlands to southern England before conquering England and returning it to the Roman Catholic fold. Displaying his characteristic aggressiveness, Drake suggested attacking this armada in the ports of Spain and Portugal before it set sail. On the 15th of March 1587, he received a commission to enact this plan. Within weeks, Drake quickly assembled a fleet of 24 ships and 3,000 soldiers. The Queen provided his flagship, the Elizabeth Bonaventure, the same vessel from which he commanded the previous year's American expedition. Drake hurried to the Spanish port of Cadiz, hoping to take the defenders by surprise. He arrived off Cadiz on the 19th of April 1587 and began his attack with a few ships without waiting for the rest of his fleet to arrive. On the morning of the 20th, Drake found a large galleon belonging to the Marquis of Santa Cruz, the Armada's designated commander, and set it on fire. Despite calling in reinforcements, the Spanish could do little to respond to the havoc that Drake was causing, who later claimed to have destroyed 39 ships, though the figure is disputed. After this latest singeing of the King of Spain's beard, as Drake's perennial attacks on Spain had become known, he led his fleet to Cape St. Vincent near Lisbon, where he continued to destroy Spanish shipping, capturing and destroying a large supply of timber used to make barrels for provisions. Drake blockaded the port of Lisbon and challenged Santa Cruz to come out and fight, but the latter was still busy equipping his ships and was not yet ready for a confrontation. Poised to do much more damage to Spanish logistics, Drake suddenly sailed for the Azores, led by reports that there were rich ships on the way. Although Drake has been criticized for being motivated by profit rather than English strategic interests, profits were clearly necessary. to ensure that Drake's private investors made a healthy return and were encouraged to finance new expeditions. After arriving at the Azores on the 8th of June, Drake captured a large Portuguese ship, the San Felipe, laden with cargo from the East Indies. Cargo, which was full of gold, silver, china, jewellery and spices, amounted to over £110,000. Though Drake was already back in Plymouth by the 26th of June, Admiral Santa Cruz embarked on a wild goose chase that caused the invasion of England to be postponed to 1588. The delay in the invasion gave Elizabeth another year to prepare for the Armada, while Admiral Santa Cruz died in February 1588 and was succeeded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia as the chief Spanish naval commander, an efficient administrator, but one with little combat experience. Back in England, Drake was invited to sit on the council which was preparing England's defences against the Spanish Armada of 1588. Two armies were raised to defend English soil if the Spanish armies landed. The English fleet was commanded by the Lord Admiral Charles Howard of Effingham. Initially, he would depend on advice from Drake as his vice-admiral. The initial English plan had been to divide the fleet into two, with Drake protecting the entrance to the Channel and Howard keeping an eye on Panama in the Spanish Netherlands along the coast of what is now Belgium. Drake hoped to launch another preemptive strike, but his efforts were hampered by a peace offer to Elizabeth from Panama, even as Drake received intelligence that the Armada was being concentrated in Lisbon and was preparing to sail for the English Channel. Drake urged the Queen for more ships for his western squadron and continued to lobby for an attack on the Spanish coast. On the 13th of May, the Queen ordered Howard to join Drake with 16 ships. After joining up on the 23rd, the two men established a close working relationship over the following weeks. In May 1588, the Spanish Armada of over 70 fighting ships, more than 50 smaller vessels, 2,400 guns, and 30,000 men left Lisbon and set sail for England. The Armada soon encountered foul weather, and Medina Sidonia ordered his ships to the port of Corunna on the northern coast of Spain. Drake and Howard received reports of Medina Sidonia's troubles and sought to take advantage, but were forced to return to Plymouth due to unfavourable winds. On the 12th of July, the Armada left Corunna and appeared off Cornwall just a week later. According to a popular legend, Drake was informed while playing a game of bowls and remained unfazed, remarking, quote, "Time enough to play the game and thrash the Spaniards afterwards." There is no contemporary evidence for the anecdote, but the wind was against the English, and it would not have done much good to put out to sea. Nevertheless, Drake must have been worried. After 20 years of attacking Spain's empire and shipping, if the Spanish armies made landfall in England, Drake would be one of their top targets for arrest and execution. Medina Sidonia had been ordered by Philip not to engage with the English fleet, but to head to the Dutch coast to join up with Parma's 17,000 men before landing in Kent. But several of his subordinates favoured an attack on the English fleet and a landing in southwest England. On the 20th, Drake and Howard left Plymouth Harbour with 55 ships, Drake on the Revenge and Howard on the Ark Royal. Although the Spanish ships were larger and more imposing, they were less agile than their English counterparts. Furthermore, Spanish naval tactics and training continued to prioritize boarding enemy ships, while the English preferred to blast at the enemy with cannon. By the 21st, the English fleet managed to position themselves with the wind behind them to attack the Spanish as the Armada sailed east towards the Isle of Wight. The San Juan de Portugal, flagship of the Spanish second-in-command, Juan Martínez de Recalde, bore the brunt of the action. While coming to Recalde's aid, the Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora del Rosario crashed into the San Juan and was disabled. On the 22nd, while pursuing the Armada, Drake came across the stricken Rosario and forced its admiral Pedro de Valdez to surrender. By the time he rejoined Howard, the English fleet was in disorder, since Drake was supposed to be leading the pursuit and had switched off his lantern. Though he captured a rich prize, Drake jeopardized the fleet and encouraged resentment among fellow captains. On the 23rd, a larger engagement took place off Portland Bill, the southernmost point of Dorset. The wind had shifted in the Armada's favour, enabling Medina Sidonia to attack, but by 10 o'clock it shifted back towards the English and allowed Drake to launch a counterattack targeting Medina Sidonia's flagship, the San Martin. Despite the intensity of the fight, no ships were sunk, a reflection of the inexperience of the crews. After another relatively ineffectual battle off the Isle of Wight on the 24th, Howard divided his command into 4 squadrons. Martin Frobisher led the landward squadron, with Drake heading the seaward wing, and John Hawkins and Howard in the centre. On the 25th, with Medina Sidonia seemingly in a position to land on the Isle of Wight, Drake launched an attack that threatened to drive the Armada aground, forcing Medina Sidonia further along the channel. On the 27th, the Spanish commander arrived in Calais in neutral France, where he believed he would be safe from English attack. Medina Sidonia and Parma also wondered how they were going to go through with the king's plan. The Armada could not use the small ports that Parma was using, but the small boats that Parma had were unsuitable for the open sea. With Medina Sidonia bottled up in Calais, Howard called a war council on the Ark Royal, which decided to send fire ships against the Armada. These were ships which were effectively set on fire and used as a kind of flammable missile. On the evening of the 28th, 8 English fire ships were sent crashing into the midst of the Spanish fleet. The panicked Spaniards cut their cables and struggled to escape from the flames. Although the fireships eventually burned out on the coast and failed to destroy a single Spanish ship, the Armada was in disarray, giving the English fleet a golden opportunity to attack isolated ships one by one on the 29th near the port of Gravelines. Howard led 20 ships to board the disabled San Lorenzo, which had lost its rudder the previous day, while Drake headed straight for the San Martin. The English ships closed in on the Armada at point-blank range, and English gunnery proved more effective on this occasion. By the time the English withdrew at around 4 in the afternoon due to low ammunition, the Armada lost 6 ships and around 1,500 men. While the Armada was still a major threat, a growing wind, signalling the beginning of a terrible and unusual summer storm in the English Channel and North Sea, was beginning to blow through and carry the Spanish ships into the North Sea. Drake and Howard shadowed the Armada along the east coast of England to Scotland, before calling off the pursuit on the 2nd of August. Though Drake was disappointed that he did not inflict more damage on the Armada, the weather did the rest. After sailing around Scotland, dozens of Spanish ships ran aground on the coast of Ireland. Nearly 24 ships were lost here, while the rest limped back to Spain. The fearsome Spanish Armada had been defeated. The defeat of the Spanish Armada inflicted a major psychological blow on King Philip. Drake now saw an opportunity to deal a devastating blow to Spain and to secure favourable trade terms by installing Dom Antonio, Philip II's rival, for the throne of Portugal as King of Portugal, though Queen Elizabeth was more concerned about attacking Spanish ships to prevent another invasion attempt. In September, a plan was in place for Drake to destroy the surviving Spanish ships in port, capture Lisbon, and inspire an uprising in favour of Dom Antonio, and seize the Azores in the name of the Pretender and use it as a base to attack future Spanish treasure fleets crossing the Atlantic from the Americas to Spain. As the Queen's treasury was running low on funds, Drake turned to his old comrade from Ireland, Sir John Norris, who raised £20,000 and was appointed Joint Commander. Queen provided 6 ships, and Drake continued to fly his flag on the Revenge. In April 1589, Drake set sail with 13,000 soldiers and 4,000 seamen aboard a mighty English armada of 180 ships, though admittedly many of these were small vessels. The Drake-Norris expedition, as it is termed, arrived to Corunna on the 24th of April. Here, Drake set about destroying the Spanish ships in the harbour while Norris quickly occupied the lower town and seized a large amount of provisions. While Drake was ready to head to Lisbon, unfavourable winds kept the fleet in Corunna, prompting Norris to assault the castle in search of more supplies. Though the assault failed, in early May, Norris inflicted over 1,000 casualties on a Spanish column of 8,000 men sent to reinforce Corunna. After the English left for Lisbon on the 8th of May, on the 16th, Norris and Dom Antonio disembarked at Peniche, 40 miles to the north of the Portuguese capital, from where they would march on the city with 6,000 men. Drake continued along the coast, intending to sail up the river Tagus to attack Lisbon from the water. On the 20th of May, he stopped at Cascais to test Portuguese support for Dom Antonio and found it lacking. While Norris was able to capture Lisbon's suburbs on the 23rd, the anticipated Portuguese uprising did not materialize, and his men were sick, tired, and hungry. With Drake's ships nowhere to be seen, Norris decided to abandon his attack and rejoined Drake at Cascais. After some attempts to rescue English honour by attacking ports in northern Spain, Drake's ships returned to England in July, following a costly expedition that resulted in the loss of around 10,000 men and failed to recoup the initial investment. In October 1589, the Queen's Privy Council charged Drake and Norris with mishandling the enterprise, and both men were summoned to give their testimony. Although he would not return to sea until 1595, the intervening 6 years were among the busiest in Drake's life. He was asked by the Privy Council to take charge of strengthening Plymouth's defences. In the early 1590s, he played a major role in the construction of a canal linking Plymouth to the River Meavy to provide fresh water to the port. As Deputy Lord Lieutenant for Devon and a Justice of the Admiralty Court, much of Drake's time was spent dealing with legal issues, including the distribution of cargo taken from Spanish ships. While Drake retained considerable influence in political and military affairs in his native county, his influence at court was diminished after the deaths of his patrons, Leicester and Walsingham, in 1588 and 1590 respectively. In 1593, he returned to Parliament as member for Plymouth, and in his only known speech to Parliament, he urged members to vote for subsidies for the Queen so that the English state could more effectively wage war against Spain. In 1595, Drake was in his mid-50s, though he had lost none of his desire to return to sea. The previous year, he received a joint commission with Sir John Hawkins to lead an expedition against Spain, but disagreements over its purpose and delays in provisioning the ships meant that it was not until August 1595 that the fleet was ready to sail for the West Indies. Before leaving, he drew up a will leaving Buckland Abbey to his wife Elizabeth and making other bequests. Soon after leaving Plymouth on the 28th of August, Drake and Hawkins started to fall out over provisions. Having lost some of the aggression from his younger days, Drake fumbled an attack on the Canary Islands to take on water. By the time they got to Guadeloupe in the Caribbean on the 27th of October, Drake hoped to go directly to Puerto Rico to confront a Spanish fleet of 5 treasure ships. This time, Hawkins preferred to wait. After the English fleet arrived at Puerto Rico on the 12th of November, Hawkins died of illness. The Spanish treasure fleet had arrived at the Puerto Rican capital of San Juan 9 days earlier and gave the island advance warning of the English approach. During the ensuing Battle of San Juan, a cannonball from the El Morro fortress smashed into Drake's flagship, the Defiance, narrowly missing the admiral at his dinner table, but wounding several of his companions. On the night of the 13th of November, Drake sent a force of small boats to burn the enemy's ships, but failed to make much of an impact before being forced to retreat. Drake decided to turn his attention to the South American coast and burned the familiar port of Rio de la Hacha to the ground. On the 21st of December, the fleet sacked Santa Marta before arriving at Nombre de Dios on the 27th. While the town was taken, the Englishman found little worth taking beyond a few gold and silver bars. Drake ordered his second-in-command, Sir Thomas Baskerville, to take the mountainous route to Panama City with 800 men, while the admiral would proceed along the Chagres River. After being repulsed at a Spanish fort constructed only 2 days earlier, Baskerville returned to Nombre de Dios on the 2nd of January 1586. Although Drake and Baskerville resolved to attack Spanish towns in Nicaragua and Honduras, and made preparations off the coast of the island of Escudo de Veraguas, the wind was against them, and on the 23rd, Drake decided to head back towards Panama. By the time the fleet was off the coast of Portobello in Panama, Drake was seriously ill with dysentery and was confined to his cabin. The admiral lay dying on the evening of the 27th and began making final preparations for the expedition after his passing. Then, the following morning, the 28th of January 1596, he asked his servant to dress him in his armour before he died. He was approximately 55 years old at the time of his passing. His body was placed in a lead coffin and lowered into the sea. The English fleet destroyed the town of Portobello and returned home, having lost both its commanders during a relatively fruitless expedition. Drake's death provoked an outpouring of grief in England and a sigh of relief from old King Philip II of Spain. The war with Spain, which he had been instrumental in causing in the 1560s and 1570s, and then fighting in the 1580s and 1590s, would carry on for nearly another decade after Drake died. Further armadas followed, with the Spanish sending another failed one against England in 1596, which was blown back to Spain before it ever reached the English Channel, and a small one which successfully landed in Ireland in 1601, in an effort to aid the Irish rebels there. When the Spanish expedition was defeated at Kinsale in Southern Ireland in December 1601, the war began to wind down, with both sides realizing that little was being gained from it for the expense of enormous sums of money. When Elizabeth I finally died in 1603, it opened the way for a resolution, and the Treaty of London of 1604 brought the First Anglo-Spanish War to a conclusion. Sir Francis Drake is a revered English naval hero today and has been ever since the late 16th century. The admiral who rose from modest means to command the first English circumnavigation of the world and spent his career at sea dealing a series of humiliating blows against Catholic Spain, including the defeat of the Spanish Armada, has been celebrated by generations of Englishmen as a figure who was instrumental in the development of an English naval tradition which led Britannia to rule the waves in the 19th century. Drake's death at sea inspired a legend in English folklore that prior to his death, he instructed one of his drums to be brought back to Buckland Abbey, saying that should someone beat on it at a moment of national peril, he would return to Plymouth from beyond the seas to defend his beloved England. The legend was the subject of Sir Henry Newbolt's 1896 poem Drake's Drum, written at a time of anxiety about Germany's naval ambitions, and later set to music by Charles Villiers Stanford in his song cycle Songs of the Sea in 1904. It is claimed that the drum was heard beating on several occasions during both World Wars, including during the evacuation of Dunkirk, a testament to Drake's legacy in English maritime history. What do you think of Sir Francis Drake? Was he the man who set the country on a path to naval supremacy? Or was he a shameless privateer who began England's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.